Dr. Anurag Gupta is Professor Mechanical Engineering at IIT Kanpur. He studies the mechanical properties of solids such as twisting, stretching, bending, the forces and the behavior of materials under those stresses. In addition to his mainstream work, he's passionate about Indian music, the kind of design principles that underlie Indian musical instruments, both percussion and stringed instruments. In this first of a two-part video series, Professor Gupta talks about the Indian drum, the membrane, the patch on the membrane, and the design principles that have underlain the evolution of the Indian tabla. And in this, he extends the work that was started sometime during the 20th century by scientists such as B.S. Ramakrishna and C.V. Raman. B.S. Ramakrishna worked on the theoretical principles of resonances of percussion, membrane percussion, and C.V. Raman worked on the empirical aspects of the same. Of course, C.V. Raman went on to win the Nobel Prize for his work on the scattering of light. And Professor Gupta has evolved a design that can actually help us create a three-dimensional image of an Indian single-stringed instrument, the Ektantri veena. In this first part, he's going to talk about the Indian drum, the design principles, and how we have come to enjoy the resonant properties of the Indian drum. So, welcome to Notes on an Indian Drum. Professor Gupta, would you be able to tell us what inspired you to get deeper into Indian music, especially the instruments?
Liking and inclination for Dhrupad. I had a colleague who was a practitioner of Dhrupad, and he would make me listen both Rudraveena and Dhrupad vocals. And Rudraveena particularly again caught my attention. The sound of Rudraveena, the construction, the whole presence of Rudraveena, that was very unusual, from what I was expecting. Of both looking at history of musical instruments. So my work is broadly, like in the subject of musical instruments, is broadly divided into two aspects. One aspect is to look at the historical aspects of musical instruments. In that, I'm primarily interested to understand where do our present instruments come from. What is the origin of not just instruments but the certain features? For example, if you have a siyahi on our percussion instruments, what is the origin of this siyahi? Because this is a very distinctive feature. I'll talk more about it later. Then you have this curved bridge on your veena, on sitar, tanpura. Where does this curved bridge comes from? So I got very curious about this, and I did not get any immediate answers. But on the other hand, more in line with my mainstream scholarly pursuits, I was also getting interested in scientific modeling. So I was sort of requested to teach this course, and I took it upon me. And when I was teaching the membrane vibrations, a colleague of mine told me to look at the work by C.V. Raman, the work that C.V. Raman has done on tabla, percussion instruments. And I very casually, I did not knew that C.V. Raman had at all worked in these areas. I casually looked at his work, and that was a rabbit hole, because very soon I found that not just tabla was just his one-off thing. But acoustics, particularly acoustics of musical instruments, was one of his major pursuits. In fact, the collected works of C.V. Raman they're present in 6 volumes, and one of the volumes is on acoustics. and majority of that volume is on musical instruments. Most of the work that he did was to do with harpsichord and violin. Like he did phenomenal amount of work on understanding the acoustics of harpsichords and violin. But he also had this sort of very small sort of diversions into working with tabla and tanpura briefly. His papers on tabla, you may be familiar, are kind of path breaking because he is the first one who pointed out that tabla, Indian percussion instruments, particularly of this kind, with the ones with this siahi, are actually musical. When he said musical, what he meant by that they had a definite pitch, something that usual drums don't. So usually drums are just meant to be beat giving or time keeping instruments. But he pointed out that these drums are actually musical. I mean, they have a definite pitch, and that got him into conducting some very original experiments. And he did that. He established why this. He pointed out clearly that it was because of the siahi, the patch that is put on these instruments. So that really got me into it. I realized that here is that thing that I was looking for. Here is something that I have been reading alternatively about, music, musical instruments, about our past. So Indian percussion instruments, I am still in that sort of foray. They're fascinating. I mean, so we started with tabla. What we did, our first work was to understand what is the role of air cavity. So tablas, like you have a daya and a baya, both have a certain air cavity. So what is the role of that air cavity in the acoustics of tabla? So that is one way we sort of took forward C.V. Raman's work. But then what was more interesting after tabla, I have two other papers, and both are drums from Kerala, both of them I found fascinating, in fact, and also I found that not much work was done. So the first thing that would be done was to understand the acoustics of idakkya. This drum from Kerala, this hourglass drum from Kerala, idakkya. What we found interesting about idakkya was, I had a student who was from Kerala. So he went on a field trip, he got some sound recordings, and he showed me these YouTube videos where people were playing idakkya and they were able to generate melodies while playing idakkya. And clearly, idakkya doesn't have any patch like tabla or mridangam or pakhavaj. So that got us curious that what is the source of this musicality to idakkya, because it doesn't have a patch, so that reason doesn't work here. So what is in idakkya that makes it musical or such an instant? And that is the second work that we did in percussion instrument, and we found it fascinating because we found that idakkya is designed, for example, the membrane of idakkya. Mizhavu is actually on the other end of the spectrum. So, for example, the membrane of idakkya is made from the inner lining of the intestine of calf.
Yeah, that's parchment.
Parchment is really, really thin, Shankar. I mean, you can actually, if you hold it, I have it around. I mean, you can just look through it. It's like a thin, transparent sheet of paper. While on the other hand, things like tabla, pakhavaj, mridangam, or mizhavu is even on the higher side. Their parchments come from the outer lining of the skin usually. So these are thicker things. In fact, mizhavu, if you see mizhavu, typical mizhavu membrane would still have hairs sticking out to it. They don't even remove hairs that carefully. So I have a practice mizhavu. It's a smaller one. So there the membrane has a lot of hairs also from the outer skin. So that was one thing interesting. But the key design feature in idakkya is if you may have seen like this instrument, it has two strings right below the membrane. So right below so it's a what are these? So there are these. So there is a membrane, and right below the membrane, just touching this membrane, there are two strings. Traditionally, these strings have been made of palmyra fibers. These days, they just put some metal strings sometimes or something like that. But so it is the interaction of these strings with the membrane, that particular way of interacting these strings with the membrane, that is giving the interesting physics here. So that was also quite fascinating, that how one was able to exploit this aspect of vibration. But then very recently, as you said, we did this work on mizhavu, and that was also fascinating because just as an instrument, it looks quite quite daunting, and the sound is the sound is often described as thunderous sound. And when you hear performances, when you see performances with mizhavu, a group of mizhavus behind and playing, it's quite a bit of experience. And there again, my curiosity was that how is this instrument different from like other large bellied drums, right? So we have this. So the most common large bellied drum is timpani, which is related to nagada. So nagada and timpani both originate from this war drums, or drums used to announce, to make announcements, to draw people's attention. Now of course, nagadas. That was sort of my curiosity, that how is mizhavu different from these things? I mean, of course, it looks very different because it has a very small mouth and it has a large belly, but a very small mouth. Unlike nagada or timpani, which has a very large mouth itself. So that got us thinking, and we spent a lot of time. And what we realized finally, and that was again quite interesting, that the interesting thing about mizhavu is that see, if you would notice how mizhavu is played in very simple styles. They just put one or two strokes. One stroke is that they just hit mizhavu at the center, and then the other stroke is that they hit it slightly off center. So it's very simple. So it's almost like in physics, in the language of physics, they're just exciting the fundamental mode. So when they're hitting the mizhavu in the center, they're exciting the fundamental mode. I mean, it's something very basic. But what is happening is that just by exciting the fundamental mode of the membrane, they're able to generate a very rich sound. That is what we understood that why that was happening. The whole design of the instrument, the whole ratio between the mouth size and the cavity volume, that was giving rise to a very large number of frequencies. And a large number of frequencies means a large number of like overtones. So just by a single hit, you are able to generate a very large number of overtones, and that's why the sound is very rich. It has some low frequency components, it has some high frequency components. Nagada, that if you hit a nagada in the center or timpani in the center, you just hear one frequency sound. So that was again quite interesting. So these are the kind of things that I did in this.
Tell us what the function is of the black patch on the membrane that you find on the tabla and the dagga.
So what happens primarily with syahi is that you're making the membrane such that it has two regions of two different densities. Syahi makes, of course, because it is like loading the membrane. That there is a part. I mean, very simply put, the syahi is very complicated. I should mention that it is not just a uniform patch of material put. And the history of syahi is also quite fascinating. You would be amazed to know that in Natya Shastra, there is a detailed description on how such a syahi should. Of course, they are not calling it syahi; they call it marjana. And there is a detailed description of how marjana of percussion instruments should be prepared. So there, of course, the material they used to expect a certain kind of clay and mix a whole lot of things into that clay, which is still to some extent practiced in. So if you would have noticed in Pakhavaj, I don't know whether this is true for Mridangam or not. In Pakhavaj, on one side, they still apply a fresh dough. On one side you will see syahi, but the other face of Pakhavaj, there is no syahi per se. Right before the performance, they will paste something like a roti, a kachi roti, and they will let it dry for a while. And once it is dried, it is like a fresh paste of material that is being pasted there. So the material, the design, there are a lot of complications there, but very broadly speaking, what it is doing is it is giving you now a membrane which has two regions of different densities, a central region of high density and an outer region of lower density. And when this ratio of densities, when this ratio of how much area you have the patch and how much area you don't have the patch, when this is appropriate, just this is enough to bring a lot of harmonic frequencies, a lot of harmony. And that is what C.V. Raman also found. And then there was a theoretical paper by an IISc professor in 50s, Ramakrishna. So there's a paper by Ramakrishna and Sodhi where they did a mathematical modeling. I mean, Raman did only experiments, but it was only in 50s that his experiments were explained theoretically. And this was the simple model that they took, just a two density model. And just with that model itself, they were able to see the essence of the findings.
What is the difference in their musical qualities of the tabla and the dagga, which together form a pair?
The dagga also has a patch. It has a off-center patch.
Okay.
It also has.
Right.
It also has a
Both of
patch.
them have.
Yeah. So that patch is slightly off-center, which is an interesting problem in itself. It is not, the patch is not in the center. It is slightly off-center. But that also has a patch to it.
Okay.
The thing with dagga is that it has a large air cavity. It is a hollow drum. The tabla, the main tabla, is not a hollow drum. Actually, it is made out of a solid piece of wood.